the world is kind of going to worms right now, and it's our ancestors who set us on this path. And it was some of their choices that we need to go in there, and we can't really we need to pull out the root of some systemic illnesses that all began with our ancestors. So however small it might seem to attend to your ancestral lineages, it's contributing to a much greater good that I believe is the only way for us to actually create a new world and a new way of engaging with the world.
This is the Unquiet Sisterhood podcast, where we have uncensored, unapologetic, and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about shit that matters in the lives of women. I'm your host, Jen Pavich.
Hey there, welcome to episode 13 of the Unquiet Sisterhood podcast. Today I'm super excited to be talking with Darla Antoine. Darla is a spiritual worker, an ancestral activist, and a healer. She's also an enrolled Okanagan tribal member and grew up in her ancestral homelands in Washington state. She now lives on over 1,000 acres in Costa Rica, and she helps to steward that land and also to connect people to the land. Darla works with her clients to learn how to connect with their ancestors and how to engage in ancestral healing. And she is also doing some amazing work with nature connection and connecting people to the land. And we're going to talk about that too. All right, let's get started. Hi, Darla. Thanks so much for joining me again on the podcast.
Thanks, Jen. I'm really happy to be here.
So I'm super excited to talk about what you do because every time I see something from you, like whether it's a post or kind of, something online, you're always doing such interesting, cool things. And I get really excited every time I read anything that you put out there. So a lot of the work that you do is kind of, like we were talking about in the space of both ancestral healing and also working with nature and elements and grounding and bringing all of those things together to basically make our lives better. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you got interested in that and what effect it's had in your life?
Yes. Okay. That's a really good question to just kick off with. Well, you and I have talked before, and I talked a bit about ancestral healing and the sort of the origin story for my interest in this work is the same, which is that I grew up in my maternal ancestral homelands where the women in my family have been for thousands of years. I've moved to Costa Rica because the man I love is from Costa Rica. I'm raising my kids in Costa Rica. So the needing to reach for my ancestors in a way that I've never had to do because the landscape is not my ancestor the way it is where I grew up. That one led me to learning how to do ancestral healing because there's ancestral connection and reverence associated with ancestral healing. But then the next step was like the land is your ancestor. The landscape is your ancestor. It holds the memories and the bones of your ancestors. And for me, that was very visceral, having grown up in my ancestral homelands and then missing that connection piece as well. And especially like wondering, okay, this just became a lot trickier. It's not like I can just teach my children, hey, our ancestors have been here for 10,000 years. Go outside and feel their presence. It's not the same thing. My husband is first generation here in Costa Rica. So, his parents immigrated from the US in the 70s. And that's as far back as my children's roots go here, where we are, to the 70s. And my roots go back here like 8 years. So learning how to connect to the land just became like the next evolution. Well, I wouldn't say evolution. It actually was just like part of my ancestral connection and ancestral healing journey. And we steward 1,000 acres up in the highlands of Costa Rica. Yeah, most of it is old growth. Some of it is farmland now, but there's a lot of land for me to connect with. And like there are more trees than people. There are more land spirits than people in this part of the world. So it also just became a way for me to like ground myself in this new country, in this new land, was to like sit down and learn to connect with my other than human neighbors. And it's still a process. It's still something I'm learning how to do and like refining and honing those skills, but it has helped me immensely. It's helped my mental and emotional health immensely in terms of like dealing with homesickness and culture shock and all those things.
So it sounds like where you grew up, and is that, remind me, Pacific Northwest?
Yes, Washington
Okay.
State. Mm-hmm.
Washington State. So it sounds like this is something that just sort of happened really naturally for you when you were growing up. And did you know growing up, like, was that in your sort of consciousness that this is the land that, you know, my ancestors have been on for generations?
Yeah, I did know that as a kid. And most of my extended family was in the area on both sides of my family. My parents, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, I grew up with them very near. But it was one of those things you don't appreciate until you're an adult and until you leave. So I didn't really understand how, just like by default, I was connected to the landscape until I was like significantly removed from it for long periods of time. And I grew up in the country. I grew up on 12 acres of a non-working farm, sort of like a hobby farm type thing. So there was the culture was much more land connected of the community I grew up in. You know, it's not like I grew up in a city. I grew up in a town of less than 1,000 people. So that also, you know, that begets begets is not the right word, but that fosters a connection to the land. Living in a rural community like that just naturally
Right.
fosters more of a connection. And then as I got older and as I started getting more homesick and like analyzing my homesickness and trying to like figure out what the different layers of my homesickness were, that really stood out as one of them. Is like, this land is beautiful that I'm on here in Costa Rica, but it's not the mountains my ancestors have looked at for thousands of years. I don't know the names of these mountains. I don't have stories that tie me to distant great uncles and aunts and these mountains, you know?
Mm-hmm. And were those stories, like when you were growing up, was that something that you talked about in your family, like this kind of connection to the land and the fact that you know, your family had been there for thousands of years? Was that like a conscious thing in your family?
Yes, but I would say not deliberate. It was more of it came, especially with my grandmother sharing stories. It would just come up, especially being out and about in the land. Stories would just pop up that she would share, or a random story would pop up into someone's mind and they would share it. But it wasn't a deliberate, now we're going to talk about these stories to maintain our connection sort of thing. It wasn't that deliberate, but it was just kind of woven into the everyday.
Okay. And it makes sense what you're saying too, like being in a rural area and on a farm, like I would imagine, like automatically have more interaction with the land and with the
Mm-hmm.
nature around you, because, you know, it's a living, breathing thing. There are, you know,
Yeah.
animals around, there are plants growing, like it kind of just brings all of that out naturally. Um, and I'm curious, have you ever lived in a city?
I have. The biggest city I've lived in is Madrid, Spain. I
Okay.
think that's about 6 million people. I was there for about a year and a half, and and I lived like on the third story of a walk-up apartment with my ex-husband. And one of the things that was hard for me, and I didn't realize it because I was really excited to move to Madrid, but I didn't see the horizon or the sunrise or the sunset for weeks at a time. And I didn't realize that was going to be difficult for me until it was difficult for me. And I even like remember telling him, I'm like, I haven't seen the horizon in weeks. I haven't seen the sunrise or the sunset in weeks. And it's really getting to me.
Yeah, I guess when you grow up just kind of seeing that and almost like taking it for granted. But it, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
does do something for you from a, you know, emotional, spiritual perspective to be able to see that every day.
Yeah.
Um, I know one of the things that you do is that you help people both get sort of connected with their ancestors to do ancestral healing, and also with nature and the natural things around them. How does that work when someone's kind of, you know, in a more urban area?
Well, that's a good question. Our ancestors are with us everywhere because they're in our bodies. They're part of our bodies. They're part of our psyches, even. So that part is easy to connect with wherever. People in urban area, some people might not even know what they're missing, so to speak. To
Mhm.
connecting with nature just might not be on their radar. So that's fine. And for others, it's kind of like my Madrid story. Like they've had some deep connection and now they're realizing they're really missing it. And because wherever they're living now makes it harder. But the thing to understand about nature is that it's all around. Even in the heart of Times Square, there's nature. It is nature. Um, and you don't have to live on 1,000 acres like I do in order to have a connective practice. It certainly helps. It doesn't hurt to have a nature community practice and have so much nature around me. But honestly, most of the nature connection I do, I walk to the edge of my yard and just sit down and start just like turning inward and grounding and just sort of like talking to the land around me telepathically, just like creating that conversation. Like I said, I just do that at the edge of my yard. It's not like I'm swathing across all 1,000 acres in order to have this big mystical practice. But yeah, so it's definitely possible for people in an urban area.
So yeah, and I found that too because I've almost always lived in not necessarily an urban area, but I've never really lived in a very rural area. But I do, there is that piece of me when, because I feel that connection, like, maybe when I'm in a park or like, like you said, just like in my
Yeah.
backyard, that kind of thing. And in the back of my head, I've always wondered, like, would that be different if I kind of went somewhere that was really sort of
Mm-hmm.
off the grid, so to speak? Would
Yeah,
that?
I think it can be helpful. I mean, especially if you're like, oh, I live in an urban setting and I'm always going to live in an urban setting. It can be helpful to learn how to connect with nature in an urban setting. And it can be helpful to remove yourself to a more off the grid, a place where there are more plants and trees than people once in a while, especially to like deepen that connection. It's immersion.
Mhm.
Immersing yourself in something is always going to help you get to know it and understand it a little bit faster and at a different level than not immersing yourself. So taking some time out for nature immersion can be really helpful.
And that seems like you can, to some degree, like maybe take that sense of connection back to whatever your day-to-day environment is and then tap into it a little more
Exactly.
easily.
Exactly. Yeah, once you tap into it, you can tap into it just about anywhere, but it can be easier to initially tap into it from a more immersive state.
Hmm. Yeah, where it's the only thing around. Maybe less
Right.
distraction, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like going to a 10-day silent retreat or something. So to learn how to really meditate. You're
Yes,
not
which
going to
has
do it
also
every time
been
you want to.
on my list of things I
Yeah.
might do.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about the ancestral healing. And one of the things that the first time I heard you talk about this, I found myself getting really curious about is number one, like what are the benefits of ancestral healing and how do we know when we need it?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll start with how do we know when we need it? I would say most of us need it, unless you grew up in a family or in a culture that regularly practices revering and making offerings and tending to the dead.
Mhm.
Then you probably need ancestral healing. Ancestral healing is one of these things that's sort of a result of the whitewashing, the sanitization of our spirituality and our death rites. So we used to have all cultures had different mystical death rites that they would help people walk through as they were dying, and then things that the living would do for the dead post death.
Mhm.
And those things, one, helped the dead move on to the next place, and it also helped them drop the baggage of this life and to drop their identification with their wounds, with their personality, things like that. Just like drop the baggage and move on. And we don't do that so much anymore. That's not such a thing. So what happens is we die afraid of death, especially in this Western culture where, like, anti-aging, youth is everything. We die afraid of dying. We die afraid of aging. We die afraid of death. Our dead are often placed away from us in hospitals and hospice centers. We're not so intimate with the dying process. And so all of those things create a disconnect. So when we die, we don't necessarily know how to shed these things, these fears, the traumas of our life, the wounds of our life. We don't necessarily shed them. So that hangs out in the lineage. It hangs out in the collective consciousness. And ancestral healing is an opportunity to go in there and to help tend to our dead that have been neglected for generations. And for some lines, it's maybe a couple hundred generations. And for other lines, it can be thousands of generations of neglect. And so it's just an opportunity to help them metabolize these things so they can move on. And so they're no longer sending the stuff isn't hanging out in the collective consciousness, and it's not hanging out in the lineage. And that's why you'll see people who, like, this illness skips a generation, or this weird addictive behavior is passed down the generation. Some of that stuff can be attributed to this ancestral neglect. And so the benefits of ancestral healing include helping to clear up some of that gunk that we don't necessarily need to be dealing with because it didn't originate with us. It's ancestral stuff that is looking for a resolution. And it also puts us back in touch with something bigger than ourselves. It reminds us who we are and where we come from. It reminds us that we're so loved and we have so much support. Our ancestors care about us like no other spiritual entity because they are a part of us. They lived and died for us. Our story is part of their story. So having that support and that connection with energies and entities on the other side can really be profound for a lot of people in terms of, like, feeling connected and loved, especially if you felt sort of like the oddball in your family. Like,
yeah. That's what I was just going to say, because I know a lot of people, maybe if they've had a difficult, like, family of origin, or even, like, maybe like a couple generations of, like, just you were talking about, like, addictions or that kind of thing. I could see maybe people being like, well, oh my gosh, I just want to, like, cut myself off from all of that and do a different thing. But I would also imagine that those may be the people that this could be the most beneficial for.
It could be. And doing ancestral healing does not necessarily mean that you need to make nice with your living family members. Mm-hmm. If your living family members are still toxic, doing ancestral healing opens up more of a possibility that they might find healing for themselves, but it doesn't mean that you need to pick up these toxic relationships just for the sake of we're family. And connecting with your well ancestors can really help soothe that pain of needing to be disconnected from toxic living family members. You can still be connected to the lineage, to the family, but you can be connected to people who are well and healthy, even if they're no longer physical. And that can be really soothing for people.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? Like, what made you decide to do this? Was it something more, within your own ancestry that you were interested in? Like, because I could see people getting interested in this when they start to do, I don't know, like family trees or that kind of thing. Or was it more that you came across the concept and just decided to do it?
A little bit of both. My mother's lineage is Okanagan and Nez Perce. And we were cut off from that in my grandmother's generation. When in the 1930s, my grandmother was sent to an Indian boarding school, and she was forced to learn English, and like her culture and language was taken. And that I've always felt that loss and always felt kind of angry. Like, that was my birthright, having that cultural heritage, that cultural connection, that whole other language, ancient language. That was my birthright, and it was taken away from me 80 years ago without my consent, without anyone else's consent. And so it was like one of those things, so close, but so far. 80 years ago is nothing in the
well, and not only that, but
world history.
a relative that you actually knew, like, because
Yeah.
that you knew your grandmother. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And she would only speak her indigenous first language when she was coming out of surgery, which didn't happen that often. But when she was heavily anesthetized, like all of her defenses around that language had to be literally anesthetized for her
Wow.
to speak that language. Yeah. So trauma there. So
Uh-huh.
I was interested in helping to heal that deep trauma. I was interested in connecting with some ancient ancestors from that lineage who could maybe like help me feel connected to that lineage, since I couldn't connect through language or culture,
Mm-hmm.
at least not yet. And my mentor, the Daniel Four, who taught me this version of ancestral healing, I heard him in a podcast talk about it as also a form of healing and tending to the earth. And that really made my ears perk up too, because I am really interested in earth healing and tending and stewarding the earth and earth connection. And it's for the same reasons. The world is kind of going to worms right now, and it's our ancestors who set us on this path. And it was some of their choices that we need to go in there, and we can't really we need to pull out the root
Mm-hmm.
of some systemic illnesses that all began with our ancestors. So however small it might seem to attend to your ancestral lineages, it's contributing to a much greater good that I believe is the only way for us to actually create a new world and a new way of engaging with the world. Is like, first we got to go clean up the shit our ancestors started. And then like become the
Yeah.
ancestors with the help and the aid of the well ancestors, like continue on a different path. And our ancestors aren't static, they're capable of change. So you might have had some shitty ass ancestors a couple generations ago. They might now realize that they were horrible, and please let me help make amends. Please let me do what I can. Let me contribute energy to your sacred work that helps balance out the shit that I did when I was alive, that sort of thing.
Wow. That's really powerful, because when you're describing this, like the going back to the root, like and I recognize that a technology metaphor might be weird here, but like what it makes me think of is like, I don't know, when you're running a software or a program or whatever, and something's flawed in the original code, like all the way back in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, like you have to go back and sort of fix that for
Yeah.
everything else to kind of, and that's so different, I think, than the way that many people look at solving problems in the world today. Like, I think a lot of people sort of have that impulse to just be, kind of, well, it doesn't matter what's happened in the past. We're just going to move forward.
Mm.
But I do think there's power in going back to that past and looking at the way things were, instead of just, otherwise you just keep doing the same stupid shit
Yeah.
because you don't realize someone already tried it.
Yeah, no, that cliche, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I think
Yeah.
that is true. And I think it's even true even in the context of the conversation you and I are having right now. I think that saying is true in ways that we don't even understand yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And it feels like we don't necessarily need to fully understand to be able to begin practicing and making it better.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that you mentioned was, you said, and I know we had talked about this before, finding a well ancestor, finding an ancestor, who's, so why do you want to, like, if we're trying to fix the ones that are damaged, why do we look for the ones that are well first?
That's a good question. The ones who are well have processed their death. They have processed their wounds and their traumas, and it's no longer something they need to resolve. So they are a good place to start communicating with, because you don't want to connect with an ancestor who has unresolved issues, because they won't be really spiritually mature enough to be of any really good help to you. They'll still be very much looking at it through their wounded, traumatized human lens. And they could say, well, I have this alcohol addiction, and I don't have a body. You have a body, and my genes are in your genes. So here, you take my addiction, you do something with it.
Mm.
That can happen. So starting with well ancestors also means that you're not going to start taking on burdens and illnesses and other things that you don't need to take on because they're not yours. It also keeps you like energetically safe because they're not going to be trying to get something from you, get something out of you, in that they're not going to try to resolve anything through you in that sense. So if you're somewhere and someone wants to invoke the ancestors for whatever reason, it's really helpful to, if they are not already clarifying, we're going to invoke the well ancestors, or you're invited to take a moment to call on your ancestors. Take a moment and make sure you're calling on, and you say the clarification of, I'm inviting my well ancestors to join me in this space for this purpose, for those reasons, because just willy-nilly opening up the door to all of your ancestors is probably not very smart.
Okay, so it's kind of like a process of starting with the well ancestors and then going into
and then
the not so well.
And yes, and in the tradition in which I've learned ancestral healing, if I was facilitating ancestral healing for you, you and I would be largely hands off of the actual healing. Most of the healing would be happening through the well ancestor. So you would be connected with the well ancestor, and you're also connected with me. So I'm kind of like guiding the well ancestor through you in a lot of ways. And it's really important that you're there versus me just like going into a light trance state and doing the work for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important for you to be there and to like have that connection and that authority and that experience with your ancestors too.
Wow. That's totally fascinating. And what, when you've done this for people, what is that experience like for the people that you work with? Do they sometimes discover things that really surprise them, or kind of?
Yeah, for some people, not for very many, because for some people it does fall flat. It's not for everybody, but I think that's maybe happened for one or two clients, and I've had a couple hundred clients at this point. Most people, they'll know before they book their first session that this is something I'm into. And actually, I think both people that it fell kind of flat, they were referred by someone else. So someone else said, I had this really great experience, you should try it. And they were just like, okay. And it didn't really, kind of fell flat for them. There wasn't much of a connection, whether they were blocking themselves or it just wasn't for them. So just want to put that out there. It might not be for everyone. Other people have felt really deeply connected to ancestors, like parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles that they love deeply, but have lost a few years ago to death. So being reunited has been really emotional for some people. Other people have been able to forgive something in their lineage or someone in their lineage. Others have had really weird, like the ancestors are showing me this vision of XYZ, and then a couple of weeks later it like clicks into place, and they're like, oh my gosh, that really weird thing just showed up in my physical reality. So like magical synchronicities happen too for some people.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I remember, you mentioning before kind of going into the different sides, because we all have like two parents and four grandparents, like kind of going into the different, so each one is sort of a different chain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you normally have people like go all the way as far as they can get through one before moving on to another one, or how does that work?
That's a good question. First, you don't need to know anything about your lineages. You can be adopted or estranged. You don't need to know anything about them to do this. But when we begin, we do an assessment and we see what's going on with each of the lineages in general. How healthy is this lineage overall? And we start with the lineage that appears to be the healthiest lineage. And the idea is some people will have a really healthy lineage and a really unwell lineage. Like it's dark, it's kind of scary. I don't really want to spend much time there. that's fine. We won't go back there until you have the health and strength of your other 3 lineages to back you up. That can be really helpful. But then we start and we scan back to when the lineage begins to look consistently healthy and vibrant. And that can be, again, 20 generations or 2,000 generations. But this is
Wow.
just going in, yeah, it's just going intuitively based off of what you are perceiving about your lineage. And so most people have to go back like pre-Christianity. That's pretty common. And if not pre-Christianity, then like for people of European descent who are now in the Americas, they have to go back to like pre-immigration. Immigration and colonizing and settling the Americas was really traumatizing for a lot of white European lineages, understandably so. Yeah, and so then we just ask for a well ancestral guide who comes from this well area of the lineage to step forward. And then we also ask the guide a few questions. Like there's a lot of safety and checks and balances in place to make sure that you're actually connecting with an ancestor who is healthy and has the authority to be helping you.
And by authority, you kind of mean like that it actually is your ancestor, or like has that sort of authority.
Well connected and healthy. Yeah, and that they're well connected and healthy with all of the other ancestors as well.
I see. Okay. Wow,
Yeah.
this is really fascinating. So, and I would imagine that this, when you look at what you're looking at a little bit more now, which is kind of the land ancestry, are you kind of doing the same thing? Is it kind of that point of like going back to a place in time where the land had that same sort of health and harmony, or, you know, is well?
I guess it could be. I haven't done that yet, but that's an interesting thing to explore. For me, my land ancestry work, one just comes with knowing for myself and helping educate my clients that the land is our ancestor. It holds the bones and the memories of our ancestors. And there's like I'm here in Costa Rica and there's a lot of trees, and these trees have roots, and the roots of the trees here are in connection and communication with the roots of the trees in my homeland 5,000 miles away. There's this, and scientists have done studies on how trees actually communicate through their root system. So it's not even just like ooh, isn't this a nice metaphor? It's like an actual thing. You can be far removed from your homelands, but be able to connect with them through the trees, for example, in an energetic way. So land ancestry comes from just acknowledging that the land is an ancestor. But then I know how to connect with the guardian of the land, who is often like an ancestor, like the spirit that tends to this particular piece of land that you're on. Where I'm at, because we are tending so much land, there's several different guardians. But being able to connect with, like, you can think of it like the Lorax for the land. You know, it's a good way to like introduce yourself to the land and ask for permission to do ritual work or spiritual work on the land, etc., etc.
Wow, that's really cool. And I know you mentioned that you are spending this summer kind of focused on helping other healers and practitioners to connect with the land and with nature to support their practices. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm opening up a nature connection and communication school. It's called Geomystic Academy, and it starts actually in October. There's going to be strictly online, or we have a guest lodge here in Costa Rica, so there's the online version, and then there's the online plus week-long retreat here in Costa Rica version. But I have a master's degree in intercultural communication, which is how we communicate across cultures, and communicating with nature is a form of intercultural communication. It's a different culture, it's a different system, it's a different everything. So for those of us who feel called to tend to the land and to connect with the land as part of our own personal spiritual practice or as part of our larger spiritual sacred work, I'm just teaching those basic skills of being able to like connect with the different elements, connect with the land guardian, all these different ritual skills that one can help you with your own work. If you're going to host retreats, I can teach you how to check in with the land guardian of the retreat center to make sure everything is kosher, everything is okay. And I want to teach people how to be able to connect with and call in the elements when they're holding a healing session for another person, because that can really help create a safer, more grounded healing space that opens up more potential for healing when you do something as simple as calling in the elements beforehand. And then also like how to identify when someone has nature deficiency and what are some things that you can gently suggest that they do to get more in touch and more grounded in nature as a healing practitioner.
Yeah. And I feel like all of that too is such an important thing for healing practitioners. Because, we know how important self-care is. And when you're holding space like that for other people, it's absolutely crucial to be able to do the self-care, do the grounding, do the, connecting that allows you to, expand and hold that space.
Exactly.
That sounds absolutely amazing. And I will make sure to put it in the show notes as well. So,
thanks.
So that everybody can check it out. So I just want to say thank you so much for being on today. And is there anything else that you think that people are usually curious about what you do, or that you want to kind of let people know about the work that you do?
Well, I would just say that your ancestors are there to support you. You have connection, you have spiritual allies in your ancestors. The elements are here to support us. The elements want to be expressed through us. They are perhaps our original ancestors. And nature as well is an ally for us. So just to remember that these things are a part of us and they wish to be a part of us and to express themselves through us, versus something that's outside of ourselves that we can touch and go connect with. Like, embrace the idea that these are a part of you and they want to be expressed through you, and see where that takes you.
I love that. That's beautiful. And it just feels like integration almost is, like what you're describing. Like that sort of, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it. And this has been totally fascinating as always. And we'll make sure to put all of your website and social media contacts and everything in the show notes, along with the retreat info.
Thanks, Jen.
When I can be